Okay, in this second video we're going to look at how some other factors, including slow wage growth, as I said, very important, tariffs, overseas growth, confidence in business and consumers, productivity, another important one, and things like an aging population and oil prices and climatic conditions can impact inflation. So the first one, slow growth in wages. As I said, it's very important at the moment. The wage price index grew by only 2.1% this year, which is only slightly higher than inflation. And the idea is that this helps to reduce firms' production costs. So low growth in wages, particularly if they're growing at a rate slower than productivity growth, should help to reduce firms' real unit labour costs, and then should generally decrease firms' production costs and decrease cost-push inflationary pressures. You can also say that slow growth in wages can contain demand as well, because people's incomes aren't rising too fast, and that can lead to help contain demand pull inflation as well, but it's mainly a factor reducing cost push inflation. So explain how higher labour costs may impact on the goal of low inflation. Again, remember you need to define what the goal of low inflation is. So higher labour costs refer to the wages and other costs associated with hiring employees. So labour costs can include things like superannuation, work cover, sick pay, etc. When labour costs rise, this is talking about higher labour costs, there is an increase in cost of production for businesses because labour costs are a major cost of production for businesses. So it's one of their major costs. So when they rise, it leads to higher costs of production throughout the economy. This forces businesses to increase their prices, otherwise their profits will fall, and therefore reduces incentives to supply and places upward pressure on prices. These factors result in an increase in the rate of inflation and can therefore hinder the government's attempt to achieve low inflation of 2 to 3% on average over the course of the business cycle. So 1 mark for being able to link it to the goal of low inflation, 1 mark for explaining what labour costs are, 1 mark for explaining that higher labour costs will lead to general rises in production costs, and 1 mark for linking that to the willingness of firms to supply, and that leading to higher prices as well. Lower tariffs, not as important for this chapter, but when we lead to lower tariffs, they lower the cost of imports. So imported cars in the CPI become cheaper, and that leads to a decrease in the CPI. It also increases the productivity of local firms because they have to compete against foreign products, and that leads to a decrease in the price of Australian products as well. Overall, this will decrease inflation because firms have lower production costs if they use imports in production. If they decide to become more productive, they will also have lower cost of production as well, helping to lower the cost per unit of production. China's overseas growth rates, lower growth rates overseas will decrease demand pull inflation. So lower growth rates overseas means that other countries demand less of our exports, particularly commodities, iron ore, etc. That can lead to reduced incomes for Australians and can also reduce the demand for tourism and education in Australia. So this is about reduced incomes overseas, All of these things leads to less net exports and lower profits for firms, which can flow on to decreased incomes for Australian workers and therefore decreased spending and decreased demand pull inflation. Investment spending might also fall because of the fact that firms are making less profit and therefore they don't spend as much. So lower overseas growth will reduce net exports, will flow on to reduced incomes and therefore reduce consumption and investment spending as well. Consumer confidence. Okay, define what it is. It's the level of optimism the consumers have about their future. It's measured on a scale of either above or below 100. Consumer confidence increases, our marginal propensity to consume increases, which leads to more spending and less saving, which boosts demand pull inflation throughout the economy. Business confidence works in a similar way. It will lead to increased demand pull inflation in the short term because it will lead to increased investment spending. So business confidence refers to the level of optimism businesses have about their future sales and profits. An increase in business confidence leads to increased investment, which boosts the demand for products. Increased investment in the short term still boosts inflation because it leads to increased demand for machinery and capital and equipment and things like that. That leads to higher prices. You could argue that in the long term, increased business confidence today may lead to reduced cost push inflation in the long term because the increased investment spending may help us to boost our productive capacity, which will make firms more productive and increase our willingness to supply. But in the short term, higher business confidence leads to higher investment and higher demand pull inflation. Okay, with productivity growth, essentially productivity again refers to the level of output generated per unit of input, and it's essentially how efficiently we use our resources, land, labour and capital to produce goods and services. So as productivity increases, This will reduce firms' cost of production as more output is being generated with less inputs, and that should lead to lower cost of production for firms. Reducing their cost of production will lead to lower prices and decreased cost push inflation. If productivity increases by more than labour costs, it will lead to a decrease in real unit labour costs, which will lead to falling cost push inflationary pressures. So if we can increase our productivity by a faster rate than labour costs increase, it should help to reduce real unit labour costs and cost push inflation. So explain how slower productivity growth may hurt the goal of low inflation. So slower productivity growth does not mean productivity is going backwards. It means that businesses are only experiencing a slight increase in output relative to inputs, which may be labour hours. If wages and other production costs increase faster than this productivity growth, this will lead to an increase in the average cost of production for businesses. For example, a higher payment is likely to be made for the factors of production, whilst the total volume of output only grows slower. So essentially what it's doing is leading to higher cost of production per unit of output. This will force businesses to either increase prices or experience decrease in profitability, thereby reducing incentives to supply and placing upward pressure on prices. These factors result in an increase in inflation and can hinder the government's attempt to achieve the goal of low inflation of 2 to 3% on average over the course of the business cycle. 1 mark for defining the goal, 1 mark for defining productivity, 1 mark for linking the fact that productivity will cause higher cost of production if productivity growth is slower than higher cost than wage growth. It will lead to higher cost of production, and that will lead to increased prices and put decreasing profit margins for 1 mark as well. Consumer confidence and productivity. So one demand side factor would be consumer confidence. When people are confident, they spend more. That leads to increased aggregate demand. If there's decreased consumer confidence, then that leads to lower aggregate demand, surpluses of goods and services, and decreased inflation. Higher productivity, again, define what it means. When there's higher productivity, it leads to lower production costs. This can be passed on in the form of lower prices, reducing inflationary pressures. Lower company taxes. Lower company taxes boost demand in the short term because it leads to increased investment spending. Firms have an increased incentive to invest due to the lower company taxes and the fact that they're going to get to keep more of their future profits, and that encourages them to invest and may boost demand for inflation in the short term. Lower company taxes can reduce cost push inflation in the long term because they're getting taxed at a lower rate, their cost of production are lower. So when tax rates are lower, it decreases firms' cost of production. Overall, lower tax rates generally increase inflationary pressures because demand shifts right more than supply shifts right, and that leads to shortages throughout the economy. Aging population. So one factor you may be asked is how do quantities of factors of production impact inflation? And one you could talk about is an aging population. An aging population will lead to lower labour force participation, which reduces the quantity of factors of production. That will lead to reduced competition for jobs, which can put upward pressure on labour costs as the demand for labour outweighs supply because there's less supply. It can also lead to skill shortages, which put pressure on cost push inflation. An aging population is potentially bad for inflation because of the lack of skills available. The tightens the labour market and decreases supply of workers relative to demand. Oil prices. Oil prices are used as a raw material cost for businesses. It's an input into a whole range of industries. When they fall, it reduces firms' cost of production, makes them more profitable. When oil costs rise, it leads to higher costs of production and increases prices and cost push inflationary pressures. Poor climatic conditions is the last one. Poor climatic conditions and natural disasters are likely to have a negative impact on inflation. They can lead to higher cost of production, particularly in agricultural businesses, and decrease firms' ability to supply because of poorer crops. That can shift the supply curve to the left and lead to higher prices. It will impact headline inflation mainly. It's unlikely to impact underlying inflation because underlying inflation takes off one-off volatile items. So if it's only the price of certain goods and services like fruits or beef or whatever agricultural products, then that's likely to lead to just impacting headline inflation. The other thing is that it also requires reconstruction often when there's natural disasters, and that can lead to inflationary pressures as well because of higher demand for resources. So it can have some impact on demand as well. Thank you.